Is there anybody here from New York? Okay. So I had the privilege of visiting this old cemetery. It's on what, 19th or 23rd, right? And at the time that I visited it, a young man named Jonathan, I think, showed me around, right? And he was saying, are you going to move it to that? I don't know how to do that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because I don't know how to do that. Okay. So he explained to me that in the restoration before they decided to do a major restoration, which I think they're undertaking now, right? A funding campaign?
Well, I think the 21st Street, Sheriff Israel
Right.
Cemetery, it has been restored.
Right. I believe the first thing they did was put ground cover, and then many, many years ago decided to, anything that had fallen down, to simply leave it down. Now there's a major restoration from the Portuguese, from the Sheriff congregation, right. Prague, we know, chose not to restore, and the emotions that come from Prague go with the concept that nothing has been restored. So in the restoration of the old cemetery in Vancouver, the first was a philosophical decision about whether to do something, nothing, or everything. My own involvement came because my grandfather was buried there, and I'd visited that cemetery many times. That's my grandfather's stone. So, because I like taking on projects and putting people together to do them, I looked at the cemetery to see, what could be done. It kind of looked like the picture on the left. It had not been used for many years, and eventually we transformed it to the picture on the right. This was the old cemetery, which was created in 1891. So there are some significant dates here, just to give you a bit of context. Before there was a cemetery in Vancouver, the deceased were sent to Victoria. We will hear more about that from Daniel Givon, where's Daniel? Who's going to lead us in the walking tour later. But I think it's important to know that in 1891, the mayor of Vancouver decided, and I have my own theory about that. I think that his buddies also came from Europe. He came from Frankfurt, who helped him get elected, were wealthy Jews. And they, the city council, or at least the mayor, decided to give a section of the city cemetery to the Jewish community. 1892, the first burial. And in 1971, the governing body, which is this synagogue, decided to remove all the upright headstones, make it easy for the lawnmowers, let the pathways be covered up, the historic pathways, and allowed the overgrowth. There was an uproar from the Jewish Historical Society saying that we can't do that, that historical cemeteries are in fact more interesting than contemporary cemeteries. And so the Historical Society pleaded with the governing body to please do not remove the uprights. And then I came along in 2012, and this is more shots of what it looked like.
There's a funny delay on the... Sorry, there's a bit of a delay on this. There.
Okay. So the first thing I did was put my own kind of ideas together. At first, I only had pictures of the old cemetery I had pictures of vandalism which took place in 2012. By the time I got involved, the vandalism had been quietly repaired, very little publicity. The vandalism was not particularly anti-Semitic, as Japanese and Chinese gravestones were also vandalized. But, yeah, leave that. But I decided I could go two ways. One, I could go to the community and have some focus groups, see what the community wanted, see what the stakeholders wanted, secure their interest, and put a plan together. I decided that would really not be very honest, because I already had an idea of what I want to do. And I thought by going the other route and having focus groups would sidetrack, and it would be easier to present a plan to the governing body rather than go to the stakeholders first. The problem of our cemetery was a little different, and I won't spend too much time on this because it's quite complicated. This Pioneer Cemetery the land is not owned by the Jewish community. The land is owned by the City of Vancouver. There are no written agreements, there were no documents, there's no leases, there was nothing. It was done on a handshake in 1891. There's not one thing in writing. So I secured the blessing, so to speak, of the City of Vancouver, who have been incredibly cooperative, presented a framework to the governing body, which is this Orthodox synagogue, who, by the way, had never had a woman at their meeting before, and presented an idea which they approved of, and we finally agreed upon some terms of reference. The terms of reference spelled out who a committee would report to, the kind of seed capital that was required. I got an immediate grant from them of $35,000. We then arranged for some private people to put in some seed money. We developed a set of sub-goals and created an action plan. I felt the next thing was to create interest in the Jewish community with media releases. This was the first time in the Jewish newspaper, I think, that they'd ever had an article about this old cemetery. I think it's fair to say that most members of our community, with the exception of a lot of elderly people, did not even know this cemetery existed, even though it's only a few blocks away from here, and it is the only cemetery, Jewish or otherwise, in the City of Vancouver. It is part of a large acreage of 105 acres. So we then determined to set up a process. We formed an advisory committee. On the advisory committee, I thought from the beginning we needed a diverse group of people. We needed people with specific skill sets. We needed historians, we needed genealogists, we needed fundraisers, we needed people with prestige, and we needed workers. We got someone from our veterans community. I found someone who was the grandson of one of the most important people buried there. I found people who were history professors, people who had never been involved in the Jewish community before, who could contribute heritage experts who could write government grants. We then found an office and hired Myra, who's putting this together today, as the project manager. From the beginning, I don't know why, but I didn't Google internet, how to restore cemeteries. I don't know, I didn't think of it. I just sort of plunged ahead. And years later, I kind of found that every step that we took seemed to be the one that was set out on the internet. We set up a reporting system, how much money we could spend without getting approval from the Sheret Tzedek, how many times a year we had to report to them, what we were doing. They placed a tremendous amount of trust in us for a number of reasons. One, because my group had a good track record, and two, because they had done nothing for the last 100 years and were relieved that a group of people became interested. The cemetery had been used up until the new cemetery that we're going to visit tomorrow was opened in 1929. After that, this old cemetery was used for immigrant people without funds, for homeless people. It was kind of just used intermittently. The next thing we did was engage the Jewish Genealogy Society. And they look for projects. It's a small group of people, and they love to do family trees. They love these kinds of projects. So we began to trace as many descendants as we could. There's 416 people buried there. I don't know how many families we found, but as we located families, we maintained communication with genealogists. Many families had not remained Jewish. Many families live in other cities. Families didn't respond to us, or families weren't interested. We gained access to all the government records. Unfortunately, the Jewish community records were probably the worst kept records. The City of Vancouver records are excellent. The Government of British Columbia records. The most important thing here is that we understood quickly we needed a soft approach to stakeholders. The last thing a descendant wants to hear is that his great-grandfather had an affair with somebody who produced an illegitimate child. Right? The last thing someone wants to hear was that his father had 3 other siblings who were all stillborn. The last thing someone wants to know is that their great-great-grandfather was buried on the edge because they committed suicide. The sensitivities, I cannot overestimate the sensitivities in restoration. In this case, we made connections. The 2 gentlemen on the left are cousins who had never met before, and their great-grandfather brought the Orthodox, their grandfather brought the Orthodox community to Vancouver. One lives in Vancouver, one lives in Seattle. They had never met before. The pictures on the right showed a temporary plaque, which I'll tell you about in a minute, with a contact. The family are still very well known in Vancouver, and they were thrilled to pay for a little headstone for this baby who turned out to be a baby sister of their father. The next part was the research and the documentation of the unoccupied plots. Again, this is very complicated in Vancouver because we don't own the land, we don't own the cemetery, but we are the governing body. In British Columbia, the only people who can reclaim unoccupied plots are the owners of the land. And there's all kinds of government rules. You have to be deceased for 90 years, and you have to advertise, and 3 months. And I'm sure in your city there's all these rules as well. The rights holders of unoccupied plots are the people who wrote the check. All of those people, of course, are deceased. So then if you are an heir or a descendant, you can apply for the right of usage. So it took a long time. We tried to find as many old documents as we could. The top document shows a transfer of 12 plots from the City of Vancouver to the Sheriff Zedek. However, the Jewish section is gridded for 600, I think, can't remember, over 600 plots. There are 400 people buried. So now you've got 200 that are unoccupied. As we located descendants, we were able to talk with them, meet with them, write to them to see if they were going to use these unoccupied plots someday, And you can imagine, with the price of real estate in Vancouver, when you find out that you own some plots, it's like this light goes off in your head that you own some property, which you don't really. But those people have the right to maintain them at no cost, to keep them, or to return them to the Sheriff Tzedek with the permission of the City of Vancouver. The legal processes in this city are complicated. One example of this, we found a woman in Beverly Hills whose grandfather was buried here, and it turns out that as a child she was the double for Shirley Temple. She lives in Beverly Hills. She wrote a letter claiming 7 empty plots, turned them back to the Sheriff Tzedek. We are allowed to reimburse her the funding that she paid for them, plus a cost of living increase. In British Columbia, you can't sell plots privately. And you can't pay market price. You pay what that person paid for. So, the next part then was to, this page is a bit different. This page is, by the way, in your handouts. We changed it a bit, right. So the next section was to establish the funding needs and set a budget. Of course, we were over budget. Our budget started out at about 400. The costs ended up at about 600. I'm happy to say that we raised all of the money. I would also like to say at the beginning of this that we decided that our skill set was better at raising money and hiring people to do the work. Many communities don't do that. As you know, there are many restoration companies in the United States, many restoration consultants who will come to your community, teach you what bleach to use on headstones, what scrubbing to do on old headstones, what cement to use to restore headstones, and communities put work parties together and they involve the community in actually doing the work. I knew that wasn't going to work here. I knew that what would work would be to hire the professionals to do it and raise the money. We did not have to outsource anything. We were so lucky to have the experts in the city. I looked for an architect who had cemetery expert in designing cemeteries, who was Jewish and who lived in the city, and found Bill. Bill brought in Cornelia Oberlander, I think one of North America's, if not one of the world's foremost landscape architects. The stone company, J.B. Newell, is right across the street from the cemetery, and they do restoration and are granite experts around North America. We did not have to go outside the city for anybody. So in putting together funding, we looked at heritage organizations, we looked at Jewish community agencies, we talked about partnership, we got grants from different agencies and gifts in kind. And from the beginning, we needed to look at donor recognition. You all know that donor recognition is a big deal. It's very tricky though. We did not want to turn this cemetery into Disneyland with plaques everywhere. There's also no building there, so we couldn't name any rooms. Right? Oh, we thought, what the world are we going to do? So, with Bill's expertise, we did it very tactfully. The first thing we looked at was community partnerships. We did the signs in bronze because that's keeping with this historical nature. But before we did that, the next one, we decided to put little, I don't know what they're made out of, they're not plastic, what are they made out of?
Fiberglass.
Fiberglass temporary markers that were found by the city of Vancouver. They cost $10 each. We brought them in from the States, and we put 87 temporary markers on unmarked burials so that our machines and our restoration would not trample the unmarked burials. With everything we did, we had a ceremony. We had a media release. We had a community event to put out these new markers. At the same time, we had extra ones made that said reserved, and we had extra ones made that said STCB, Shared Setting Cemetery Board, so that eventually, as we sold plots, we could put STCB on them, so somebody knew that was for sale, and we put reserved ones on the ones where people had decided to keep them in their family. And then we started to design the new cemetery. The first thing we did was do a grid in terms of what pathways we wanted to recreate. We decided not to recreate the old pathways. Bill, do you want to talk about how this grid for a minute?
Sure. Post-war, the cemetery itself tried to reduce its maintenance and operations costs by raising the ground level about 12 inches above the original grade, and in doing so, it eradicated the pathway system that defined the grades when the cemetery was first built. They also flattened thousands of headstones so that they could more easily mow the lawn. Fortunately, in the Jewish cemetery, Shirley, you would know more about this than I, but there was resistance to flattening the headstones. So it really represents one of the images of the way the larger cemetery that it sits in would have looked like historically. Nevertheless, the ground level was raised in the Jewish section. So the first thing we had to do was do some temporary sort of test excavations to see what was underground. And it revealed just a plethora of amazing finds, you know, curbing made out of granite that had family names set in it, the occasional grave marker, and then also the pathways themselves. So once we did this, it was very surgical and very delicate. We had to use small equipment so that we wouldn't damage things. But once we went through that process, then we made this map, and this map shows, I'm not sure if it shows up very well for you, but the darker lines in this site plan represent where we found original granite curbing, and then the lighter gray is where they were absent or destroyed, and that gave us a way to measure and form a kind of strategy for how to replace them. In the end, we decided not to use granite curbing. It was so expensive, but we did some very finely cast concrete, and felt that that was okay because we didn't want to misrepresent as well part of the history of the cemetery. If we had just replaced all the curbing, the story is different, if you know what I mean. When you go to see certain buildings, say in Athens, that have been repaired after millennia, they often repair the new portions in a different stone so that it's clear what is new and what is old. So with Cornelia and ourselves, we decided on that strategy. And this is an image of it once this pathway was discovered, and then you can see the new curbing going in and then the lawn being repaired.
We also uncovered names that were on the curbs. We uncovered stones. The stone to the left there had been covered. We were specific that it be accessible for wheelchairs, although it's a little bit tricky to push on the pebbles, I think still, but in any event. And we then had long talks about, okay, what new amenities do we need? Okay. For sure, we needed a couple of benches. That's me sitting down there. That's me, right? Okay, so it was important, as Bill just said, to put contemporary features, but keeping them within the historical nature, but not making them pretend that they were old. We recreated the old gate. We found an ironmonger, is that the word? An ironmonger in our community that could recreate the gate, adding the date up on top. Then how do you recognize the donors? We had an opportunity from a lead donor to rename the cemetery. We turned that down. The cemetery doesn't have a name, it's just called the Old Jewish Cemetery. Some people called it the Pioneer Jewish Cemetery. We did not want to put a name on it. However, we agreed on the left side of the gate, which you will see, to put the story of Mountain View, and on the right side of the gate, you see those sort of curved metal pieces, the story of the donor. We had the garden, we put a wall, we had a garden wall named, and we had the plaza named. We had donors' names in bronze with a certain cutoff date. Now it's interesting that under pressure, we put the large donors first, as everybody does, and then smaller donors. But in the program for the rededication, we put everybody alphabetically. The washing stations were donated, the benches. We are the first cemetery to have a bench outside the gates for the Kohanim. We created as many naming opportunities as we could, again, considering the fact that we didn't have a building. And then we looked at agreements. I think suffice to say it took 123 years and 18 months and 4 lawyers to get agreements. Again, the City of Vancouver had nothing on file. It was important to create something that we felt comfortable with. We went through many levels of the City of Vancouver that didn't understand what we wanted, and finally, we did it. And we have 2 agreements. We have an oversight agreement that says that this will be in perpetuity a Jewish cemetery, open to Jews of any affiliation, that the rabbi of this synagogue will be the final arbitrator in case of a dispute, that this will be the governing body. This picture is of the city manager and me and the cemetery manager and the lawyers. The second agreement is a grave pricing agreement, which again may be unique to this city. In recognition of the capital investment that we made, which was $600,000, the City of Vancouver agreed to turn over an equal value of unoccupied plots in the Jewish section that they had reclaimed, with a small fee mandated by the provincial government for perpetual care. Now, just because I know you're curious, and everybody's curious as to plot prices around the world, it's good you're sitting down, because in the larger cemetery at Mountain View, which again is the only cemetery in Vancouver, plots now sell for $24,000. Some are still at 22. So they turned over 36 plots to us for $4,000 each, which is the perpetual care fee mandated that you have to put into a trust account. which we can now sell at retail. We then agreed to sell these at the same price that we would have to pay for other ones, $22,000. That's kind of oversimplifying it when we run out of what we have. Okay. So we have that great pricing agreement, and then we formalize maintenance contracts, what maintenance the city will do, what maintenance we will do. Okay. The last part of this, and actually we're right on time, and because after that's a 5-minute video, if you can get that. So the last part, which was really the first part, was to ensure public involvement, because we never wanted this to be neglected again. So we had media releases, we had a dedication ceremony. We have some copies of that booklet here, and if we can put them on the table if you want them. Yeah, and I can get more because I've only got about 10. So we had dedication ceremony. We decided not to have any dignitaries cut the ribbons. We used, I don't like to say that word, but we had children who were 4th and 5th generation cut the ribbons. Those are my 2 little grandchildren at the end. We then had a baby headstone unveiling cemetery at a later date for 87 baby headstones that we created for little tiny ovals, and that was from the generosity of one donor who gave us $50,000 for baby headstones. We have a relationship with a high school to use the cemetery for grade 10 projects, a Jewish high school. They come out and they pick a headstone. The cemetery does not allow rubbings of stones, but they then research who that person was, what the epidemics were, how come so many babies are there. We have several graves of people that were killed by electric cars, which we tell the kids were not Teslas. They were the old electric trams that ran in this city. And we've had a number of events out there. We try to, we have not gone into any tourist publications, but that will be done. We also have a program which we haven't put a lot of effort into yet. We have a connection with a company called Admired Life. Does anybody here have a connection to Admired Life? It's a California-based company whereby you can upload all the information on your family for $50, or a family of the deceased. It's GPS based, so then you go to your iPhone when you're out that cemetery, and you go to John Smith, and the information comes up on John Smith. You can also do little microchips. We thought Admired Life was a good idea. We've done it with half a dozen. We were going to charge $180 and then forward $50. Somehow it hasn't taken off, but it could be. That concludes my presentation, except recently we received an award from the City of Vancouver, which was a Heritage Award. I'd now like to turn this over to Bill to continue on some of the projects that he did, and then when he's finished, make a short video.